Welcome back to part 2 of the evolution of Hyrule, where we look at the overall history and the changes in geography of the most prominent kingdom found in the Zelda series, the Kingdom of Hyrule. In the previous episode we covered the unified timeline, which spans from the creation of the world to Ocarina of Time. If you haven't watched part 1, I highly recommend checking out that one first, as this episode will pick up right after Ocarina. So let's dive right back in. When we last left off, we analyzed the differences between the Hyrule in Skyward Sword, Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Ocarina of Time. We talked about migration, geographical renaming, plate tectonics, and other aspects which could have had an effect on the biggest changes found in the geography. Now, before we can move further up the timeline, we of course have to mention the timeline split. As most of you know, after the events of Ocarina of Time, the chronology of the Zelda series no longer follow one set path. Instead, it branches off into 3 different realities based on the outcome of Ocarina of Time's ending. One in which Link is triumphant in defeating Ganon, and one where the King of Evil slays the hero in battle. Additionally, the branch in which he is triumphant in turn splits into 2 separate timelines because of the advent of time travel. So this means we now have 3 different Hyrules, 2 of which the hero of time departed from either by death or time travel, and one in which he persisted and lived out his life. It is also from this point that we will start to see Hyrule change much more drastically in all 3 branches, and this is in large part due to the presence and influence of Ganondorf/Ganon. Today we take a look at the Downfall timeline, which follows the hero of time's defeat. This is by far the strangest timeline branch. It is the only one that lacks any of the mainline 3D titles, and instead is a dumping ground for the majority of the 2D and top-down installments. So let's continue down the Downfall timeline. First up is A Link to the Past. Before we look at the actual map, we have to mention an event which took place between Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past, also known as the Imprisoning War. This basically refers to the same event we see play out in Ocarina of Time, where Ganon is sealed inside the Sacred Realm by Zelda and a group known as the Six Sages. The big difference being that in this timeline branch, Ganon extracted the Triforce of Courage from the fallen hero, and later another piece from Zelda as well before getting sealed. His sealing also didn't happen right after the battle with the hero the way we saw in Ocarina, but instead this happened after a long and fierce war between Ganon, the remaining Hylians, and the sages under the command of Zelda, who eventually emerged triumphant. Now trapped inside the Sacred Realm but in possession of the full Triforce, he uses it and wishes to rule the world, transforming the Sacred Realm from a paradise into the Dark World under the rule of Ganon. This doesn't satisfy the King of Evil, as he seeks dominion over not just the Sacred Realm but Hyrule as well, which is where the events of A Link to the Past pick up, where Ganon uses stealth and corruption in an attempt to break free from his prison and conquer Hyrule proper, which of course in the end gets foiled by Link, who takes the Triforce from Ganon and wishes for all evil done to Hyrule to be undone, as well as revert the Sacred Realm back to the paradise it once was. In the previous episode we used Skyward Sword's map as a basis to analyze the changes in Hyrule, because it's the very first game in the chronology. Since Ocarina of Time is the game which all subsequent timelines stem from, it only makes sense that we use it as a basis for all timeline branches following that game. Again, if you want to know how Ocarina's rendition of Hyrule came to be, check out part 1 for more details on that. So here we have Ocarina of Time's Hyrule and A Link to the Past Hyrule. Yeah, this is a tough one. There are some consistencies to be found, like Death Mountain still residing to the northeast of the castle and the desert lying to the west, although slightly more to the southwest. But there are also some major differences which require explanation. The Lost Woods suddenly lie to the northwest, whereas before it was to the southeast. Kakariko Village is now located to the west, right below the Lost Woods, instead of close to Death Mountain. And Lake Hylia all of a sudden has shifted to the southeast. We don't have a clear idea how much time has passed between Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past. The opening prologue of A Link to the Past, which, as mentioned before, describes the events taking place right after Ocarina of Time, simply states long ago. So at the very least we know that enough time has passed that the events of Ocarina of Time have turned to legend. It's also obvious that despite some of the massive differences, this is still the same Hyrule from Ocarina of Time, and not a completely different area like in Minish Cap. In that game, locations like Death Mountain, the desert, and other recognizable landmarks were missing, but in A Link to the Past, these locations are present. So let's try to make a bit more sense of it. Death Mountain doesn't require any explanation. Its location relative to the capital of the Hylians is still consistent, found to the northeast. The desert no longer being called the Gerudo Desert and instead the Desert of Mystery can also be easily explained. The Gerudo, being loyal to Ganondorf, were either exiled or killed during or after the war, so the Hylians likely just renamed it to Desert of Mystery, since its former occupants, the Gerudo, are no longer living here. Next is Lake Hylia. The sudden shift to the east of this iconic lake is a bit harder to make sense of, but not impossible. The best theory I can come up with is that the lake dried up over the many centuries, and a new one formed next to it. There is some evidence to support this because if we look at the map, the location where the lake used to be is now a swamp. I believe that this swamp might be the leftover of the lake from Ocarina of Time, which could mean that the Swamp Palace is actually the remnants of the water temple which was built at the bottom of it. Meanwhile, a new lake formed to the southeast, which we will get into shortly, as this also ties into the Lost Woods. Kakariko Village, no longer residing at the foot of Death Mountain, is also not that hard to imagine. Perhaps the old village from Ocarina of Time was destroyed during the Imprisoning War, and later rebuilt in this new location. A fierce war can absolutely cause changes like this. Since the village was mainly occupied by Hylians, it and the main capital were probably the prime targets of Ganon's army. Even the absence of the Temple of Time makes sense in a way. After all, its primary function was to serve as a gateway to the Sacred Realm, but now that Ganon has been sealed inside it, they may have felt it was best to dismantle the temple altogether. Or just like the original Kakariko village, the holy site may have been destroyed in the war as well. This also explains why the temple is never seen again in this timeline branch. We also don't see any remnants of Castletown or Lon Lon Ranch. Instead, almost all of the Hylians either live at the castle or the newly built Kakariko village, and farming is also done inside or around this settlement. Which leads me to believe that similar to the old Kakariko, Castletown and the nearby ranch may have also been destroyed during the Imprisoning War. As mentioned before, the prominent Hylian settlements would have been the prime targets during this conflict. Now, this is skipping ahead a little bit, but the absence of Lon Lon Ranch in A Link to the Past is actually explained later down the line. In A Link Between Worlds, which revisits the same rendition of Hyrule found here, the owner of the milk bar states that the milk he sells comes from Lon Lon Ranch. This would mean that the ranch does still exist, even in A Link to the Past perhaps, but resides outside of the borders of the kingdom somewhere. Where that might be is anyone's guess, but it was apparently relocated after the war against Ganon, which is a neat little detail. But it's the Lost Woods that stick out like a sore thumb. As mentioned before, it used to reside to the southeast, but now it's found to the northwestern corner of the map. Had it not been called the Lost Woods, we could have easily deduced that this is simply a different forest altogether. But because it carries the same name as the forest from Ocarina of Time, it makes it a bit more of a head-scratcher. Still, the only plausible explanation I can think of is that this is indeed a newly discovered or newly formed forest. So then, what happened to the original Lost Woods? You know, the one from Ocarina of Time, which lay to the southeast? Well, I think this forest is at least partly at the bottom of this newly formed Lake Hylia. This might sound like a bit of a stretch, but it isn't too crazy. The Lost Woods, or rather the Faron province as a whole, has always had a connection to water. In Ocarina of Time, the Lost Woods were directly connected to Zora's River, but it goes back even further than that, all the way back to Skyward Sword in fact. Here, the province is watched over by Faron, also known as the Water Dragon, and in the later stages of the game, she is revealed to have flooded the entire forest to prevent enemies from wreaking havoc. I'm not necessarily saying that it was Faron who submerged the forest in A Link to the Past, but it does stand as an example that the original Lost Woods is prone to flooding, which could be why there's no longer a forest to the southeastern section of the map. Additionally, it's possible that there was always a forest somewhere above the desert, since that part of Ocarina of Time's overworld was unexplored. The Hylians may have wanted to keep up with tradition, and with the loss of the original Lost Woods decided to give this newly discovered forest the same name. Another indication that this is not the same Lost Woods from Ocarina of Time is the absence of the Deku Tree and the Kokiri. Neither are ever seen again throughout the rest of this timeline branch, which could indicate that they were wiped out during the war and subsequent flooding of their home, which is kind of a sad reality to think about. The Master Sword being in the forest instead of the Temple of Time also makes sense. After all, the Hero of Time was killed in this timeline branch. After his demise, the fate of the sword would have been entirely up to the sages or the royal family. And if what we discussed before is true and the Temple of Time was indeed dismantled or destroyed, they may have felt it was best to place the legendary blade deep inside the forest out of sight from the rest of Hyrule, especially since the sword no longer served as a key to the Sacred Realm. More details surrounding the impact of the Imprisoning War can be found when we look at the races found in A Link to the Past compared to Ocarina of Time. There's no real point in listing, honestly, because all that is left of the familiar faces from Ocarina of Time are the Hylians and the Zora. The Gorons have completely disappeared from Death Mountain, indicating that they were either wiped out during the war or decided to move outside of Hyrule to prevent getting caught in the crossfire of another major conflict. The latter of which is the most likely scenario, and one we will get into soon. As mentioned before, the Kokiri are gone, and the Gerudo were either exiled or killed. And although the Zora are still technically present in Hyrule, you might notice slight difference when compared to their Ocarina of Time counterparts. I won't go into too much detail as there's already videos out there which theorize about the evolution of the Zora, but the short version is that at some point during the Imprisoning War, the Zora split into two factions. Some decided to flee the kingdom along with their guardian deity Jabu Jabu, others decided to stay behind and evolved into the River Zora we see in A Link to the Past. Hence why Zora's domain no longer exists in this timeline. Well, not in Hyrule anyway. All that remains is Zora's River, which is where the more primitive and hostile branch of the Zora still live to this day. The location of their original domain, which used to be above the original Lost Woods, was abandoned, and it's possible that the Hylians took this opportunity to build the Eastern Palace here. I mean, why let a good patch of land go to waste, right? So with all that said, we have ourselves a new version of Hyrule all laid out. A lot has changed since Ocarina of Time, and although not every explanation is rock solid, we at least have some sense of what could have happened in the countless years between the two games. Now it might seem like I'm absolutely crawling through this timeline since we only just got done covering the first game in this branch, and we're already 10 plus minutes in, but things are about to speed up significantly, as many of the games following A Link to the Past take place either outside of Hyrule or the exact same Hyrule as the one found here. Which brings us to Link's Awakening. This game marks the first time in our trip through the timeline that we play as the same Link from the previous installment. So far, every game in the chronology has taken place so long after the other that the Link from the previous adventure has long since passed. But not this time. Link's Awakening takes place only a few years after A Link to the Past. At some point after Ganon's defeat, Link grew restless and decided to sail on a solo adventure outside the borders of Hyrule in order to refine his combat skills. Where he set off to exactly is unknown, as this is never touched upon in any of the backstories. But after having fulfilled his personal quest, he attempts to return to Hyrule via the sea once again. His vessel is struck by lightning and he gets stranded on a mysterious island as a result, which is where the events of the game pick up. There is very little to cover here, as we have no idea where Koland is located relative to Hyrule. All we know is that it's in the middle of a vast sea or ocean somewhere. And of course, more importantly, the island isn't even real, just a dream manifested by a sea leviathan called the Windfish. Link eventually succeeds in escaping from this dream world and he arrives back in Hyrule, which leads into the Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Upon arriving back at Hyrule, Link is summoned by the Triforce, who requests Link to help save the kingdoms of Holodrum and Labrina. Well, requests is a strong word. It doesn't seem like he had much of a choice, to be honest. He just gets sent into a portal, no questions asked. It isn't until he's already spinning into oblivion that the Triforce urges him to, quote, accept our task. Look at poor Link over here. He doesn't know what the hell is going on. Speaking of Link, yes, this is again the same Link from the previous two games, which at the time of this recording is the only time in the history of the series that we play as the same hero for 3 consecutive adventures. 4 if you count each Oracle game as a separate quest. There is again not much to analyze in terms of geography or history. Holodrum and Labrina are each separate lands and don't belong to Hyrule. Labrina is ruled over by Queen Ambi, making this a monarchy, while the only form of leadership we see in Holodrum is mayor rule, which means that similar to Termina, Holodrum is a democracy instead. Despite this, these two territories do seem to have a friendly relationship and connection to Hyrule. Unlike other kingdoms or territories like Termina, we find Triforce imagery here. We also find a rendition of Impa who was last seen in Ocarina of Time. Even Princess Zelda herself pays a visit to each respective land when you link the two adventures together. This means that these territories are not only familiar with Hyrule and its royal family, it also hints that they likely exist on the same physical plane, and not in a parallel dimension like the Sacred Realm, Twilight Realm, Termina, Lorule, and so on. This is further evident from the presence of the Zora and Gorons. Holodrum features Goron Mountain, where they live in large numbers. These These could very well be the ancestors of the Gorons who fled Hyrule around the time of the Imprisoning War. And the same thing goes for the Zora, who have their own domain in Labrana, and these Zora resemble the ones we last saw in Ocarina of Time, rather than the monsters we find in A Link to the Past. Even Jabu Jabu, also last seen in Ocarina of Time, is found here, though it is unknown if this is the very same or just a descendant. But given the fact that Oracle of Ages features time travel, I'd say this is most likely a descendant, since Jabu Jabu from Ocarina of Time was already an adult when we first met him. Next up is A Link Between Worlds. In terms of geography, there is, again, very little to talk about. Not much of Hyrule has changed, and the overworld is still pretty much identical to the one from A Link to the Past. Only around a century or so has passed since. And although the Link and Zelda we find here are descendants of the ones from A Link to the Past, some have speculated that this old man found in the game may very well be the so-called hero of legend, that being Link from the previous 3 adventures. Not confirmed, by the way, but the evidence is quite convincing. Check out Zeltic's video if you want to learn more. The only significant event that took place between the last game and this one is that apparently, for some reason, the Triforce split into 3 pieces again. The Triforce of Power again returning to Ganon, even though he was seemingly killed at the end of A Link to the Past. But whatever, I guess he can always be resurrected or summoned somehow. The Triforce of Wisdom ending up with the new incarnation of Zelda, and the Triforce of Courage remained in the care of the sages and is later bestowed upon Link. The game also introduces us to yet another parallel world named Lorule, a kingdom opposite to Hyrule, like a reflection or mirrored version of the kingdom. Many initially confused Lorule with the Dark World from A Link to the Past, and who can blame them? They both appear as darker versions of Hyrule, and Lorule even features the same overworld music. But nope, they are unrelated. As you may remember, the Dark World was simply the Sacred Realm turned evil when Ganon obtained the Triforce. Lorule, however, is a completely different story. It's a kingdom with its own royal family, own renditions of Link and Zelda, and has its own Triforce and even Sacred Realm. The reason why the kingdom looks so dark and depressing is because instead of sealing their Triforce like the Hylians did, they flat out destroyed their relic altogether in hopes of ending the endless conflicts plaguing their kingdom. Turns out that when you do this, the land slowly starts to fall into decay. Other than that, there isn't much to talk about when it comes to Lorule. One could speculate endlessly how this all works in the first place. I mean, the introduction of a second Triforce poses so many questions. Did the 3 goddesses of creation make 2 of them? Or did Lorule have its own rendition of the 3 goddesses? Does this mean that there's now a Hexaforce? Is it possible to possess 6 pieces of the Triforce? Or is the Lorulean version of the Triforce simply an antimatter version, thus the very same, like a shadow? Plus, if Hyrule has an antimatter version of itself, do other kingdoms and locations have one as well? Or the whole world for that matter? I don't know, this is all very confusing the more you think about it. Besides, this isn't relevant to this video anyway, since we are primarily focusing on Hyrule. Speaking of relevancy, next is Triforce Heroes. Now, the premise is ridiculous, and the events taking place in this game have little to no impact on Hyrule or its history. The Link in this game is the same one from A Link Between Worlds. Well, 3 versions of him anyway, which is kinda weird. In terms of the land itself, called Hytopia, it was once its own kingdom, but at some point after the events of the game lost its autonomy and was absorbed into the Kingdom of Hyrule. We even know its location relative to Hyrule, which is said to be above it, meaning Hyrule expanded its borders to the north during this time. One final piece of trivia that might have some relevance is that most of the inhabitants of Hytopia have rounded ears, rather than the familiar pointy ears the Hylians have, and that the Hytopians possess strong magic-wielding capabilities. Where have I heard that before? Never mind, let's not go there. What follows after is the original Legend of Zelda on the NES, which takes place a long time after the previous games in this branch. Since the game barely has any story to speak of, there isn't much trivia when it comes to the game itself. In fact, the most significant events took place in the lead-up to this installment. For whatever reason, the royal family of Hyrule managed to screw up once again, and used the Triforce for an unknown cause. This backfires greatly. The Triforce was shattered into pieces, once again, and the once prosperous kingdom declined and was reduced to a small regional power. And regional power can be used very lightly. If you thought Breath of the Wild had a post-apocalyptic world, the original on the NES puts it to shame. The game features no towns, no Hyrule Castle, and the only people still living here are hiding in caves or underground. Probably because, surprise surprise, Ganon is back. How, what, why, I don't know, but he's back. He still has the Triforce of Power, and by the time the game starts has already kidnapped Princess Zelda, the sole survivor of the royal family. His goal is to locate the Triforce of Wisdom, which in turn was broken into 8 pieces by Zelda and hidden across the land. Finally we can pull up a map again. And yeah, this one is different? Very different, unrecognizable even. Whatever went down between the last game and this one, Hyrule has completely changed. Aside from a large graveyard, which is obviously man-made, there's no other trace of civilization left, let alone a kingdom to speak of. Furthermore, all landmarks have shifted into vastly different locations. Lake Hylia is now at the center of the map. Death Mountain is still to the north, the Lost Woods to the southwest, and there is sort of a desert, though this is definitely not the Desert of Mystery formerly known as the Gerudo Desert. It's on the other side of the map, bordering the mountains, and is so small I'm hard-pressed to even call it a desert to begin with. But what is perhaps the most noticeable about this Hyrule is that for the first time in the series, the territory borders a sea or ocean, which is an interesting detail since historically Hyrule has always been a landlocked kingdom. Not counting Wind Waker of course, since in that game Hyrule is the ocean because it was flooded. But excluding the Great Flood, none of the games we've covered so far, nor the games from other timelines sees Hyrule bordering a sea or ocean, until Breath of the Wild. The sea borders reside to the east and south of the land, and we can even see that Lake Hylia has a river running all the way down south, which could mean that it is connected to the sea and thus now a saltwater lake. I've been dreading trying to explain this game's Hyrule ever since I started this project. And honestly, I can do very little other than to say this is the very first game in the franchise, long before there were any plans for sequels or roadmaps for the rest of the series. The sudden presence of a sea, or seas plural, tells me that half of the map is still part of the old Hyrule from A Link to the Past, and the other half completely new territory since all recognizable names are found to the west of Lake Hylia. Any location past the east side of the lake is not something we know from past games, and as said before, we suddenly reach a sea border. This sea could have always existed even in A Link to the Past, but was outside the explorable section of that game. It could even be the very same sea Link traversed during Link's Awakening, and as we will soon come to find out, there is much more where that came from when we take a look at Zelda 2. That is pretty much it for this Hyrule. Since there are barely any inhabitants to speak of, there's no real point in talking about races. This land is predominantly home to monsters now, and what was left is taken over by nature. The last thing to mention in terms of story is that right before her capture, Zelda dispatches her nursemaid Impa to look for help, who ends up running into Link and the events of the game pick up. By the end, Link defeats Ganon, takes the Triforce of Power from him, Zelda superglues her piece of wisdom back together, and bada bing bada boom, the duo holds up the 2 pieces in triumph. The end. But wait, 2 pieces of the Triforce? Enter the final game in the Downfall timeline, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, which features the same Link from the last game, who is now a young adult rather than a kid. The main goal of Link's quest here is to retrieve the final piece of the Triforce, the missing piece of courage. Ganon isn't actually in this game, or at least not if you're successful, that is. Instead, Ganon's minions are trying to resurrect him by killing Link and using his blood to bring their master back. Also, there's another Princess Zelda who actually isn't the same Zelda from the last game, but rather a distant ancestor of her, who's been asleep for thousands of years because of a spell casted on her. So, there's 2 Zeldas living in the same time period? Did I mention this timeline branch makes very little sense? Story aside though, this game actually neatly ties into its predecessor. It is here that we find out that Hyrule, despite being a fallen kingdom, has actually persevered far outside of its original borders, and it's spread out onto different continents separated by a sea or ocean. And though this map looks completely bonkers compared to anything else we've seen so far, the original overworld from the last game is present on this map, right here. It's a bit of a crude depiction due to the graphics, but everything matches up. It also shows that Death Mountain is way bigger than we saw previously. We were only exploring the very edge of it in Zelda 1. So all this time, people have been living outside the previous overworld in newly built towns and settlements, which explains why the overworld was so empty and barren. People had migrated to new territories to the north and even other continents across the seas. There is still barely any trace of an actual kingdom. No castle or a main capital anywhere. All that remains are secluded towns, which interestingly enough are all named after various historical figures from Hyrule's distant past, most of which being the sages from Ocarina of Time. The town of Ruto, Saria, Darunia, Naburu, and Rauru. No town of Impa, unfortunately. That's kind of harsh. There is a town called Kasuto, which is said to be named after an unseen sage from the past, one we've never seen and likely never will. Oh, and there's a town called Maido as well. Really? The guy who constantly tried to downplay and ruin the Hero of Time's mission out of pure jealousy? That's the guy you're gonna name your town after? Alright then. Anyway, if we would cross-reference the map from Ocarina of Time and later A Link to the Past to that of Zelda 2 with Zelda 1's overworld included, we can see that there is very little to say when it comes to comparisons. By the time Zelda 2 takes place, the original Hyrule has long since fallen, and the population has moved out of the borders of the original territory. In fact, if we look at the scale of Zelda 2's overworld map, knowing that this tiny section here is the entire world of Zelda 1, this new Hyrule is actually the biggest rendition of the land ever, spanning multiple continents. A Link to the Past's overworld would probably fit right here somewhere on Zelda 2's overworld. So you can see just how big this new land actually is. This land probably always existed outside the borders of Hyrule, we just never got to see it. It makes you wonder how many more continents are out there. Even though this timeline branch is kind of a dumping ground for many of the older games, and thus makes a lot less sense than the other timelines in comparison, it does its name justice. It's a timeline in which Hyrule started as a powerful kingdom and slowly declined until there was almost nothing left of what it once was during the era of Ocarina of Time. Instead, this brand new land exists, and we have no idea about the future because this is the last game in this timeline, and honestly, I highly doubt there will ever be a game which details anything about the future of this place. And that concludes the episode. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next part in which we will cover the child timeline. I hope to see you then. A big thanks to my amazing Patreon supporters and channel members, of which I have 2 new heroes joining the cause. Say hello to Fuzzy Paws and Alex Sands. Also, an additional shout out to Austin Yu and Midnight Naomi, because I'm an idiot and I accidentally used an old version of my credits in the last 2 videos, so they were left out. So let it be known, they are very much appreciated too, and I will make sure to do better at keeping my list up to date from now on. That is all for now. This is Dawn signing off, and have a good one.